Thank you very much, Simon. On the 8th of November 2016, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi came on the television to announce that Indian currencies with face values of rupees 1,000 and rupees 500 would no longer be legal tender. These were equivalent to 15 US dollar and 7.5 US dollars respectively. This also comprised of 86% of monetary value in circulation in India. A day after the announcement, the banks were closed, but then when the banks opened, there was absolute chaos across the country at every bank branch. I was a part of one of these lineups that day because I wanted to have experienced this thing to be able to come and speak about it here. I don't call these lineups, these are more groin-to-groin mobs that you must participate in to get your work done in that country. Now remember that 86% of monetary value was suddenly no longer in circulation, which meant that people did not have money to do any kind of transaction between them, and they were desperate to convert whatever they had into legal tender. Indian Prime Minister's economic advisor, India's finance minister, and the head of the central bank, called the Reserve Bank of India, did not know about it until it was publicly announced, which means that the decision had been taken the way kindergarten students take some decisions. Now, there was an attempt across the board to convert whatever cash people had into legal tender. What you see here is a bunch of politicians distributing what was now illegal tender, to poor people in their communities as loan, so that these poor people could line up outside the banks to convert the currency for them. The problem was that Prime Minister had announced that you would be able to convert only 2,000 rupees in those 3 months into legal tender, which was about 30 US dollars per person. They applied indelible ink on your finger so that they could trace you if you wanted to go repeatedly to convert your money. But it took people hours, and often people lined up very early in the morning to get their money converted somehow. Now, people were getting desperate in this country. They no longer wanted to buy anything except food. So the problem then started with manufacturing processes. Manufacturing plants did not have buyers anymore. They could not pay their suppliers. Their suppliers could not pay their own suppliers. The end result was that the manufacturing units and the informal Indian organizations laid off tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people from their jobs. But even those young people who could actually work decided not to go to work. They instead created a whole mafia system to convert what was now illegal tender into legal tender. Here you see is a shop which is converting what was now illegal tender at a 20% discount rate, and then they could send other people to line up to convert this money and book a 25% profit. Now, of course, these young people were doing what was profitable to them, but ladies and gentlemen, you have to ask yourself, is that a wealth generating activity? But now the problem was becoming much bigger. Because hundreds of millions of people had no jobs anymore, they could not buy food. The food prices over those 3 months crashed by anything between 25 to 50%. Did famine hit India at that time? I don't know, because the media is 100% controlled by the Indian Prime Minister these days. I was there in India throughout most of those days, but of course, I'm a relatively rich person who does not have to venture into the poor parts of the country. Hundreds of people died in those lineups. And I'm only talking about those people who died in the lineups, or groin-to-groin mobs, whatever you call them. As happens in India usually, when someone dies, you leave that person aside and preserve your place in that mob. If I were a part of that mob, I would have done exactly the same. That's how India works. But now the problem was becoming worse. Farmers could not sell their produce, and they could not profit from what were they selling. They dumped their produce without selling them because the cost of transportation was suddenly higher than the revenue they could get from selling their produce. In essence, the whole economy was in seizure. It was entering a phase of trauma in those 3 months. These were the sites across the country at every bank branch in that country. Now, this is a very funny thing. Everyone I know suffered hugely from demonetization. The middle class of India gave its wholehearted support to demonetization. But ironically, the biggest sufferer, the poor people, also gave their support. The question any rational person should ask is, why? Why was this increased support for Narendra Modi against something that had hurt every single individual? Now let's talk about the middle class. In any sane society, the middle class is the moral backbone and intellectual backbone of that society. It isn't the case in India. The caste system is not just a caste system in that country, that is in the DNA of the culture of India. The middle class has zero compassion for poor people. They don't really care if hundreds of millions of poor people die in that country. That is the character of the middle class in India. Moreover, the middle class of India thinks they are the most honest people in the country because they pay their taxes. And of course they pay their taxes because their taxes are withheld by the government of India when they get their salaries. Now, this middle class is the same middle class that is the biggest collector of bribes and corruption in that country. But so what? Hypocrisy and mental dissonance allows you to separate the two things. You accept that you pay taxes, but ignore that you collect bribes. The question is, why did the poor people support demonetization? Now, India is an extremely tribal and superstitious society. People don't have the concept of causality. They cannot connect causes with effects. People are told to believe in something and they come to believe in that. And that's how the poor people in that society, which is at least 80-90% of the society or more, think. And they have come to accept that somehow their drudgery and wretchedness would decrease as a result of demonetization. Now, let me also add that this does not mean that the Indian middle class is not tribal and superstitious, except that they are probably more tribal and superstitious. The only thing is that these people should have rebelled against demonetization, and the poor people did not do that. But underpinning the whole thing was that Modi had alluded to one thing in his speech. He had convinced people that everyone would get about 22,000 US dollars deposited into his bank account after the end of the corruption in the country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you only have to do kindergarten level math to understand that even the richest country in the world cannot provide for $22,000 of free money for its citizens. But in case of India, this equates to 13 years of GDP per capita of India. This is an absolutely impossible figure for India. But listen, when greed takes over, you don't think anymore. So what have I said so far? The state, as I showed in the video, treated its citizens with indignities. It humiliated its citizens. It killed hundreds and thousands of its own people. Do you think a non-corrupt society can emerge from that? The middle class, the biggest collector of bribes in the country, actually got an opportunity to collect more bribes. Income tax officials and police were everywhere collecting as much bribes as they could. Corruption had shot through the roof in that country. But really, underpinning everything was that everyone was expecting a lot of free stuff. Now, who is there to tell me that this had anything about getting rid of corruption? There was corruption all over it. And the reality is, I'm more than 50 years old, and I have yet to meet an Indian public servant who does not ask for a bribe. But ladies and gentlemen, we should not stop here, because that is only the symptom of the whole problem. We are usually tempted to blame everything on the governments, but there is a bigger iceberg below the tip of the iceberg. Corruption is the way of life in India. Corruption fuels that society. Contracts between companies are based on corruption and bribery. Private companies will not honor the contracts they make with each other. And this is a consistent feature of Indian industry. But not just companies, that is the feature of families and friends, relationships in that country. You cannot trust your own friends and families in that country. The ecology of the country is that of corruption. How do you get rid of corruption from that society? You should not even attempt that, ladies and gentlemen. In conclusion, and I'm going to go on for a bit longer, but in conclusion so far, this is a funny thing that happened. Demonetization was not only a complete failure, more than 100% of the currency in circulation was deposited with the banks. According to the report released by Reserve Bank of India in August 2017, which actually was a 7 or 8 month delay by the Reserve Bank of India in counting the cash which had already been counted once. They said that by then they had counted 99% of the currency that was supposed to have been deposited, that was in circulation. Now, I know several people here could not convert their currency, as Indian government does. The promise that is written on the currency notes that you had was not kept. You had no option to convert the Indian currency that you had in your pocket into legal tender. A lot of Indians, including me and my parents and other relatives I have known, forgot some currency units here and there, and we forgot to convert those. Despite that, 99% had been counted and collected according to Reserve Bank of India's report in August 2017, which tells you something very interesting. They achieved the exact opposite of their stated goal. They actually laundered counterfeit currency into legal currency. Now, Indian society cannot operate without cash. 100% of that cash is back in the market again. It's back with a vengeance. If you look at events in India through Western lenses or lenses of a developed country like Hong Kong, you misunderstand what's happening there. What you see is an attempt to decrease corruption. This had nothing to decrease corruption. This had everything to make India a tyranny and a police state. But moreover, there was indeed an attempt to increase tax collection in a society where 66% of people operate in agriculture and related businesses, and more than 90% people are in informal economy. But remember, these are wretched, poor people. By forcing them to get involved in the tax collection process of India, what you do is you destroy the backbone of the economy. The Indian economy's backbone is not the formal economy, not the manufacturing system, not the IT system. Indian economy's backbone is its informal sector. Its backbone is the poor people of that country. The rest of them are paper shufflers, including me. But let's take a closer look at India to understand if demonetization, even in an ideal situation, would have been at all possible. This is a normal scene in India. Anyone who has been to India sees this. 40% of Mumbai is slums. People live in slums and thatched houses in that country or sleep in the open. What you know formally as concrete houses look like this in that country. They're crumbling. There's garbage absolutely everywhere in that country. And waterways are completely polluted, and air is completely polluted in that country. That despite the fact that India actually completely missed the manufacturing revolution. It's a wonder how they achieved that. Most people don't have water supply. Lucky people like me might get half an hour to an hour of water supply a day. If that's only with rich and lucky people like me. Rest of the people, and these are actually also lucky people because they actually have tankers supplying water to them. Other people, the vast majority of Indians don't even have access to this. Let's look at some numbers to understand what this means. India is one of the poorest and wretched countries in the world. It is more poor than Cambodia. It's more poor than sub-Saharan Africa. It's more poor than sub-Saharan Africa, even if you exclude the effect of South Africa and Botswana in the calculations. More than 1 out of Indians go out in the open to poop. Officially, and this is only official number, 35% of Indians are illiterate. My guess is that the real number is at least twice as much, if not higher than twice as much. 39% of Indians are stunted. Children are stunted. 44% of Indian children are malnutritioned. More than 50% of Indian women suffer for anemia. Now just revisit these two numbers again. Officially illiterate and stunted children. Ladies and gentlemen, these people are incapable of understanding a 3-word sentence. You have to communicate with them in short 2-word sentences. Do you think digital economy would work with these kind of population? But then let's move on. 240 million Indians actually do not have electricity connection. Lucky and rich people like me who have electricity connection don't have it several times a day, every single day. Close to 1 billion people in that country have no internet connection. Those lucky and rich people like me who have internet connection, the connection is very slow. The question is, how naive you must have been to think that you could make India go more digital than any other country on this planet. But this woman who sits outside the bank every first of every month to collect about $5 or $7 worth of pension, out of which she has to bribe, finds that her money from her bank account disappears. Then the bank charges her fees and penalties and commissions and tax on top of that. She's required to understand, to have a computer so that she could do her transactions on internet. 83% of Indians don't have smartphones. She is required to have a smartphone so that she can get an OTP on her smartphone so that she can authenticate her transactions on her internet. She's required to have an electronic national ID so that she can generate a duplicate electronic ID number to be used for short-term transactions. I don't understand how all that works. I don't care to, but she is required to understand that. Do you think this adds up? But ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure a lot of you have experience calling up your banks or service providers in the Western countries. I don't know how it works in Hong Kong, but when in Canada I call up my bank, the call sometimes goes to India, and my heartbeat goes up quite a bit. Because I know that any conversation will be circular and my problem will stay unresolved. The problem is that in the West, you have access to the best Indians possible. The reality of India is that Indians are extraordinarily unskilled to operate in an organizational environment. Any organization of 2 people in that country has 1 person too many. I refuse to use my ATM card in that country. I don't have a credit card in that country. And there's a simple reason behind it. I know a lot of well-educated people who have never used their ATM card in that country. I bought a plane ticket last year using my debit card. The money left my bank account. The money never arrived at the travel agent's account. This was like Expedia travel agent, the local biggest Indian company. The money wasn't there, the money wasn't here either. I had to send someone, which is how it works in India, I had to send someone close to 100 times to the bank to locate that money, push them into doing something about it. 4 months later, I got the money back without any interest. Can digital economy work in that country? Is the question we must ask. The reality is that this was not just about police state and tyranny increasing in that country. This was a great leap forward of Modi. Let's absorb this scene for a second. I was on a plane last week on my way to Hong Kong, and this was the news I read, so I copied it to show to you. More than 25 million people applied for jobs in one single organization. This is more than not just the workforce of Australia or Canada, this is more than the total populations of these countries. That is the desperation that India faces today. There's a massive amount of unemployment in the country, and now you have increased the transaction costs of people by enforcing the new regime of taxation and digital economy on that country. This country simply cannot work with that kind of increased cost of technology. Let me give you an example. In October 2016, before demonetization was announced, in my area, I could get a person to work for 8 to 10 hours of hard labor for $5.4. Today, in April 2018, I can get the same person for $3 per day of hard work, and he's lucky if he can find a job. His fall in salary has been about 40% or more, while food prices are up by about 50%. Remember, I told you farmers could not sell their produce during the demonetization process, and now they did not have the cash to sow for the next season. So the food prices are up now. Please do not ask me when I'm finished how these people survive. So in conclusion, the demonetization process was a complete failure. It achieved the exact opposite of the stated goals. It increased corruption and it laundered counterfeit currency into legal currency. All the cash that was in the market earlier is already back into the market. And it is easy to understand this. A person who earns $3 a day cannot really have the skills and the capabilities to understand the digital economy. Moreover, he simply does not have the time to chase the banks to recover his money from the banks. It has been almost 18 months since the time demonetization was announced. However, Indian companies, Indian small organizations continue to fail even today. The economy is in a trauma. What is happening in India is not that they are trying to use technology to make life easy for people. Technology is being used to convert India into a full-blown police state. Now let me tell you, this police state of India will not be Nazi Germany kind of police state. It will start to look more and more like Mugabe's Zimbabwe. Remember, India is an extremely chaotic place. That is the future of the police state of India, Mugabe's Zimbabwe. India is an extremely tribal and superstitious country. Such a society should be aggressively decentralized. As I said earlier, in India, an organization of 2 people has 1 person too many. This country should be aggressively decentralized. However, the tribal leaders in a tribal society actually want as big a tribe as possible. And that is exactly what has been happening in India in the last 70 years. India's tribal instincts have continued to permeate the institutions of the country since the time the British left that country, and this has done no good to that extremely poor and wretched country. Let me end this with another video of the demonetization process, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things here. There is this one goon in uniform who is managing to beat up hundreds of people at the same time without any fear of any consequences. These human beings were supposedly the ones who fought against the British for their independence. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.